Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It is without question that military violence means an enormous harm for the respective population. People get killed, body and soul of the survivors suffer great pain and sorrow. Therefore, one tends to regard military violence, a war, to be contradictory to human dignity. On the other hand, we have to look at the reality of endangerment of human dignity by political suppression, by the suppression of liberty. Let me look at the question at stake from the other side and ask, is it legitimate to defend political liberty and with it human dignity by military force? This, as you all know, is not a theoretical question. And I will do this in 5 steps. Step number 1 is to explain the concept of the autonomy of the individual. The second step, the autonomy of the individual in society. The third is the concept of the autonomy of the individual as political challenge. Number 4 is the essence of the war over Ukraine. And the 5th, the geopolitical dimension of this war. There's a very close relation between human dignity and the freedom of the human being. We have been talking about this earlier. To be a free human being in a very general sense is part of the dignity of a human being in our understanding. Having said this, I need to clarify the notion of freedom I'm talking about and reason why it is a realization of dignity. The understanding is more comprehensive than just a freedom of choice. Freedom of choice being the freedom of the shopper in a supermarket who has the choice of many sorts of bread, fruits, t-shirts and whatsoever. Freedom in this sense is the freedom of action. It remains in the horizontal dimension, to choose from the different options that life presents. The autonomy of the individual is more than the freedom to do what one wants. Autonomy, in the very profound way, carries the meaning of self-determination of the individual. The human being is able to fundamentally relate to values and norms and make a decision about values and norms he or she wants to stick to. As autonomous beings, we are able to relate to the religious question, contemplate the religious message or messages we are confronted with, and make a decision to become or not to become a believer. The religious decision, the question of whether or not one follows the invitation to believe in a certain faith, is life-deciding. With this decision, in whatever direction it goes, one's life is put under a holistic perspective. For example, to live a life as a devoted Christian with an eternal perspective for each human being gives a complete different turn than to confess as a non-believer to a purely immanent or materialistic interpretation of the world. Talking about the autonomy of the individual then means to talk about very fundamental decisions a human being is called to make. Who am I? Where am I coming from? Who do I want to become? What are my gifts and how can I make use of them? Which profession do I want to take? And what do I consider to be right or wrong? And what do I consider to be valuable? What are my values? The sum of these decisions make up one's moral identity. In answering to these fundamental questions, a human being takes up the challenge to create one's own moral identity. In theological terms, we call the gift of our life, beyond the physical existence, to be the gift of the freedom of choice to create oneself the personality he or she wants to become. And this is the true freedom God has given to humankind. This is, of course, an enormous responsibility we are bearing for our life, and the danger to fail is real. Failing in this sense means to remain behind the possibilities given. Rather than speaking about freedom, I would like to speak about the autonomy of the individual. The Greek notion, autonomos, carries the above described meaning of freedom. The individual can decide under which moral law he or she wants to live. Now, the human being is constitutively a social being, meaning that we need the other to become ourselves. as the baby needs his or her mother and father to be able to develop his or her personality. As the community is a prerequisite of the individual, we shall now ask for the relevance of the autonomy of the individual for the society. My second point. The autonomy is relevant for the individual as well as for the social life. In what sense? An answer to this question is found in the conditions of community life. Whenever human beings are living together, they have to follow some sort of rules. The reason for this that human beings are finite, living under limitations. We have limited resources, and our life is in constant danger and has a definite end. Therefore, human beings throughout all their history have been struggling to survive in face of limited resources, facing the reality of limitations of time and of death. The only way to escape this life-threatening danger is community life with definite rules, where the individual receives some sort of protection. Clear rules regulate community life ever since and provide a way of escaping the conflicts within the community. Our Western post-Enlightenment understanding of the individual being autonomous has to conciliate the need of the individual to subject under community rules for the purpose of protection. The main question of Enlightenment philosophy was whether this need to subject under law is a violation of the freedom of the individual. The answer was to be found in the autonomy of the individual, in the sense that each citizen has to participate in the development of the law under which he or she lives. And even more, whether it was a violation of the freedom to enforce law against the free will in cases needed. The answers are given with the reasoning about how law is generated and who decides about it. Basically, there are two options that still exist. Law can be generated by autocratic decision or by democratic process. Both ways do not only exist even today, but they are the key issue in the struggle in Ukraine. Being a post-Soviet state until the beginning of the 21st century, the Ukrainian law was created by autocratic decision. And that was exactly the point that many people were demonstrating against during the Orange Revolution and on the Maidan. Freedom in the sense of the autonomy of the individual means just the opposite. Each citizen has to be an equal member of the Ukrainian society and has to have a say in the democratic process. As a bystander from afar, I witnessed that the Maidan demonstrators wanted nothing less than a change of the political system from the autocratic rule to a participatory system where each citizen has a say on how he or she wants to live in this society. One could say that the recent Ukrainian events are a flashback to the European political history at large. Our common history in all European societies can be written as a history of the struggle of liberation of the individual from the absolute rule of the monarch and as the birth of the autonomy of the individual as a citizen. This is why we Western Europeans felt so much sympathy with the Maidan demonstrators and had welcomed the Ukrainian society now being really a part of the European family. And on the other hand, this is exactly explains why the Russian autocrats were so highly alerted with this option of the Ukraine now looking west. The process of generating law in a democratic society is very different and much more complicated than in an autocracy. What an autocrat can decide by himself over the rules a respective society has to live under, in a democracy, diverting concept and options of a good life and the way to achieve it are existing and have to be compromised. The process of generating law is long and arduous. Democratic societies in search for common rules need to solve two problems prior to generating law. First, they need to develop a consented procedure of developing these rules. This consensus has its importance as not everybody will agree to the outcome of the procedure, the concrete rule. Secondly, the limits have to be defined within which rules can be developed, as not every rule can be called a law. With the word of St. Augustine, even robber bands or the mafia do have rules, but we would not call these rules law. Law needs to be oriented towards justice to deserve the name law. The value basis of any law that governs a society is not simply existing, but needs to be defined. Values have two sources. One is tradition. Values in a society came down from former generations. They are the experience preceding generations have made in their struggle for a society, and that is oriented at the needs of their members. The more recent history of European and American societies struggling for values has brought up a catalogue of human rights. This catalogue results from the fight of freedom for freedom of the individual, the experience of former generations of the limits that law has to respect to be truly called law. The beginning was the Magna Carta in the early 13th century in England as a result of the struggle for security of law against the despotism of the English King John. Later in the 18th century, during the French and American Revolution, political participation was at stake. At the beginning of the 20th century, women were striking for their right to vote. Later, black Americans against racism, and nowadays handicapped persons for respect and equal rights. In many countries worldwide, religious freedom is in danger and many other human rights. While the catalogue of human rights has been developed in the course of history, we find systematic theological and moral arguments for their legitimation, even though they are denounced as decadent Western or European values by some representative of autocratic systems. Basic human rights find their legitimation in the conditions of the human being, in the way we are created. There is first of all the right to life, the right of food and shelter. In our condition as social beings, the right to be part of a society and participate in this society are founded. And in our human condition as rational beings, the right to think and speak out freely and to communicate are founded. These are basic bases for religious freedom, the freedom of conscience, the freedom of speech, and the freedom of the press. Again, as they are all rooted in the condition of human being, from the point of view of a Christian theology, they are based in the creation by God. My third point is the concept of autonomy of the individual as a political challenge. As described above, the concept of autonomy is a danger for autocracies, as the current Russian or Chinese government. If we sum up what has been described above, it becomes clear that the Ukrainian people at the Maidan stood up for a revolution in public affairs. They were striving for an organization of public affairs with the autonomy of the individual at its core and the respect for basic human rights. In the Ukrainian context, the quest for political participation, free vote, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of the press, control of the power and transparency of public expenses by independent control to avoid corruption is a political program to deprive the ruling oligarchs from power and to gain control over the security forces. In other words, the rule of the people, and this is the meaning of the Greek notion demokratie, demokratein, means there is a danger to autocrats, to those who don't want to share power and public revenues, and who in consequence will fight against such an understanding of politics. So the core of the Ukrainian conflict, of the uprising of mainly young people in Kyiv here, against the authoritarian rule and their quest for dignity was nothing else than an expression of the autonomy of the individual. The Ukrainian people, at least that's what I have witnessed as a bystander, the Ukrainian people, dominated by a small ruling elite, stood up to become citizens claiming their rights. The Ukrainian people converted themselves from a heteronomous object of politics into self-determining subjects of Ukrainian politics, and this way started a new chapter in Ukrainian political history. It goes without saying that such a political revolution in Ukraine, if it is successful, becomes an imminent danger for the current political elite in Russia, as it would ignite the suppressed Russian opposition, showing that resistance against autocracy is possible and self-determination an option with future. This was and is a danger for those few autocrats still remaining in power. It can be no wonder that those in power in Moscow interfered in this uprising. Ukraine, with a democratic parliamentary system based on the rule of law, would spread the virus of democracy and would ignite an uprising against the autocracy in the Kremlin as well in Belarus, as these autocrats are denying their subordinates fundamental citizen rights. Taking this into consideration, the struggle for Ukraine, with Russia interfering in eastern Ukraine, turns out not to be primarily an interstate war between two neighbors over conflicting interests, but rather an ideological controversy between two controversial political systems within Ukraine, with Russia playing a decisive role. A democratic system is based on the acceptance of its citizens as far and as long as their respective rights are respected. If not, the democracy comes to an end very quickly. Democratic governments, with the word of the former US President Abraham Lincoln, are governments of the people, by the people, and for the people. Governments are run by the people, based on the people's will, and have to work for the people's common good. An autocratic system, in contrast, is not based on the acceptance of its citizens, but on force. As people usually are not freely devoted to their autocrat, internal acceptance often is created by directing the attention to an external enemy, trying to rally the people behind the leader and the flag. While autocracies usually need an external pressure to create internal cohesion, democracies usually don't need this, as political systems are ideally based on the free will and acceptance of its citizens. Internal stability is created from within the system through this political acceptance. The Ukrainian society, as far as I have seen, it was split over the issue of the described political revolution. Quite a part of the Ukrainians, not only in eastern Ukraine, positioned themselves in defense of the traditional Russian political and culture system they were used to. For them, the Ruski Mir ideology offered an alternative interpretation of this political struggle. Ruski Mir embraces different, religiously based Great Russian ideologies, serving as an important legitimation for a reconstruction of the metaphysically comprehended Great Russian Empire. Great Russian ideologies and dreams of a Great Russian Empire implicitly deny the right of existence of a Ukrainian nation, as well as a sovereign Ukrainian state. In this sense, history is used, and different narratives of Ukrainian history are told depending on the political position in this struggle. For example, the famous baptism of Prince Vladimir in 988 on the Crimea, the baptism of the Kyiv Rus, is used to legitimize Russia's annexation of the Crimea in 214. My fourth point is the essence of the war over Ukraine. The political struggle and the war in Ukraine and over Ukraine was both a struggle of the social and political direction of this post-Soviet society, and secondly, a geostrategic struggle between Russia and the West. These two struggles are intertwined and enforce each other. The inner Ukrainian conflict about the individual autonomy and political self-determinations divides the society. It includes the fight against the rule of the oligarchs, as well as the struggle for political and economic participation. This conflict touches the interests and values of the West, EU and Russia and USA, as well as Russia's. Therefore, both Russia and the West supported opposing sides within the Ukraine. EU and USA were in support of the Maidan demonstrators. Russia backed the Yanukovych government. This way, the inner Ukrainian antagonism of different models of society could at the same time become a geostrategic controversy in which external powers try to influence this inner Ukrainian struggle in accordance with their interests. Political conflicts usually are solved by compromises. But is it possible to compromise over the fight for autonomy and political self-determination? I hold the position that it's not, which makes the Ukrainian struggle so severe and dangerous at the same time. At the Maidan, a fundamentally different understanding, not only of the political organization was at stake, but of human dignity. The Maidan demonstrators opted for the society that is composed around the idea of freedom, or more precisely, the autonomy of the individual. The individual that is free in the sense that he or she has to take over the complete responsibility of his or her life in a very profound way. For the Ukrainian demonstrators, this meant to liberate themselves from being defined as I would call it a homo sovieticus, a human being as instrument of government politics, as Professor Marjunovic put it today, who is seen as part of a mass, where individuality and free will are not relevant, where the state bears the ultimate responsibility for the fate of the individual. This means to be a drip in a sea, where the single human being bears no rights as such except as being part of the mass. This understanding of human being is in contrast by the idea of the autonomy of the individual and has immediate political consequences. My last point, the geopolitical dimension of the war over Ukraine. The struggle for Ukraine has another dimension that is immediately related to the strive for autonomy. Citizens of the European Union were thrilled by the Maidan demonstrators, seeing them as a democratic uprising and as such the continuation of the liberation process of Eastern European nations in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia and the Baltic states after 1989. While cheering the Maidan demonstrators, most Europeans misunderstood them. People and governments in the EU mainly interpreted the democratic uprising in the Ukraine to be simultaneously the wish for EU membership, and another extension of the EU to the east was to be the consequence of the revolution in the Ukraine. For quite a number of Europeans, a possible membership of the EU meant that sooner or later Ukraine would join the European security structure as well. Did the Maidan demonstrators ever think of becoming a member of NATO? I don't know. Most likely not. But for most Europeans, this was a logical consequence as it happened in Poland, Hungary and the Baltic states. Even more was the situation in Ukraine interpreted on the basis of the Charter of Paris for a New Europe from 1990. In Paris, at the end of the Cold War, the European states, the USA, Canada and Russia, had signed this document, which is breathing the democratic optimism of the early 1990s. Peace would spread through democracy, the rule of law, and sovereign equality of states. Democratic values were understood to be a prerequisite of a peaceful European order. Implicitly, this quest included the claim for democratization even in Russia. And with some optimism, one could expect some political change under Yeltsin. But obviously, most Europeans neglected the political change towards autocracy under Putin at the beginning of the 21st century and continued to interpret the Ukrainian revolution on the basis of the Charter of Paris from 1990. The Maidan revolution seemed to demonstrate that democracy and peace were spreading, and political change in Russia was only a question of time. While I do hope for political change towards democracy in Russia myself, it is a question of political prudence to be aware that the current Russian leadership under Putin could not imagine the Russian society changing into a democracy and had to interpret any intention of democratic change as threatening its own political position. Autocrats naturally fear the democratic challenge. While this is not surprising, one has to be astonished that neither the European Union nor US politics took this into consideration. Obviously, there was little to no understanding that any support for the democratic movement in Kyiv led to ringing the alarm bells in the Kremlin. The autocrat in the Kremlin could not understand Western support other than as an aggression against his rule and reacted this way. This is no legitimation of Russia's reaction to the Maidan revolution and to the change of government in Kyiv, but it was foreseeable and a failure of EU and US politics not to have taken this into consideration and plan ahead. For the Ukrainian people, the right for autonomy and political self-determination gives and gave the right to stand up and defend this way of life against any threat. It is a question of prudence to try to solve this struggle with diplomatic and non-military means. Thank you very much.